Dr. Elena Vasquez pressed her palm against the bioscanner and watched the laboratory doors slide open with their familiar pneumatic hiss. The Meridian's edge hummed around her, its quantum drive maintaining perfect stability as they drifted through the Kepler 442 system. She'd grown accustomed to the ship's rhythms over the past 3 months, but today felt different. Today, she was meeting her new research partner. "Computer, where is the Velnari researcher?" she asked, adjusting her lab coat. "Researcher Zarathus is currently in Bay 7, examining the Proximan reproductive specimens." The ship's AI responded in its maddeningly cheerful tone. "Shall I inform her of your arrival, Dr. Vasquez?" "No, I'll find her myself." Elena grabbed her data pad and headed toward the specimen storage bays, wondering what her new colleague would be like. The Velnari were notorious for their analytical minds and emotional restraint, perfect for xenobiology research, though possibly terrible for conversation during those long shifts cataloging mating behaviors across 17 different star systems. She found Zarathus hunched over a containment field, her pointed ears twitching slightly as she manipulated a holographic display of cellular structures. Elena paused in the doorway, struck by how remarkably human her partner appeared, save for those distinctive elongated ears that marked her as clearly alien. "Fascinating," Zarathus murmured without looking up. "These Proximan gastropods mate continuously for 72 hours, then expire from exhaustion. Such dedication to reproduction." "And such poor timing," Elena said, stepping into the bay. "Most species at least try to survive the process." Zarathus straightened, turning to face her with large, curious eyes. "You must be Dr. Vasquez." "I am Zarathus of the Third Research Enclave. Your reputation precedes you, the human who discovered that Rigelian crystalline entities reproduce through harmonic resonance." "That was mostly luck and a malfunctioning sonic shower," Elena admitted. "And please, call me Elena. We'll be spending a lot of time together studying the intimate habits of various life forms. Formality seems unnecessary." "Intimate habits," Zarathus repeated, her ears perking up noticeably. "Yes, I find myself quite curious about reproductive behaviors. Your species, for instance. I have read conflicting reports about human mating patterns." Elena nearly choked on her coffee. "I'm sorry, what?" "Human reproduction," Zarathus said matter-of-factly, returning to her holographic display. "The data varies wildly. Some sources suggest humans mate only during specific fertility cycles. Others claim continuous receptivity. It is quite puzzling from a biological standpoint." "Right. Well, that's not exactly. I mean, we're here to study other species, not." Elena fumbled with her data pad, hoping to change the subject. "Should we review our mission parameters?" "Of course, though I remain curious about the discrepancies in human reproductive literature." Zarathus manipulated the hologram, zooming in on the Proximan specimens. "These creatures fascinate me because they represent the extreme end of reproductive commitment. I wonder if any species approaches their dedication." "The Aldorian flame birds come close," Elena offered, grateful for safer ground. "They perform courtship rituals for up to 6 months before mating." 6 months of courtship for a single mating event. Zarathus's ears drooped slightly. How inefficient, though I suppose romantic dedication has its merits. Elena studied her colleague's profile, noting the subtle way Zarathus's expressions played across her features. Despite her analytical manner, there was something endearingly earnest about her curiosity. "Computer," Zarathus called out, "access human reproductive behavior database." "Oh, that's really not necessary," Elena started. "Database accessed," the AI announced. "Would you like the clinical summary or the recreational overview?" "There's a recreational overview," Zarathus asked, her ears practically vibrating with interest. Elena covered her face with her hands. "Computer privacy mode now." "Privacy mode engaged. Though I should mention, Dr. Vasquez, your elevated heart rate suggests significant emotional arousal." Perhaps you should discuss stress management with your colleague. I'm going to reprogram that AI to speak only in ancient Vulgate, Alina muttered. Zarathus tilted her head, studying Alina with scientific precision. Your species exhibits fascinating physiological responses to discussions of reproduction. Is this a defensive mechanism? It's called embarrassment, and it's perfectly normal when your research partner starts interrogating you about human sexuality 5 minutes after meeting you. Interrogating? I was merely collecting data. Zarathus looked genuinely puzzled. Among the Velnari, reproductive habits are discussed as casually as dietary preferences. I apologize if I have caused discomfort. Alina felt her tension ease slightly. There was something disarmingly innocent about Zarathus's directness. It's fine. Humans are just more private about these things. How curious. Privacy regarding reproduction seems counterproductive to species survival. Zarathus returned to her specimen analysis, but Alina noticed her stealing glances. I suppose this explains the contradictory data. Human researchers are reluctant to provide accurate information about their own species. We prefer to study other species' mating habits rather than our own, Alina agreed. Less awkward dinner conversations. You discuss reproduction during meals. Zarathus's ears perked up again. Fascinating. Velnari consider it inappropriate to mention bodily functions while consuming nutrients. Alina couldn't help but smile. I'm beginning to think this partnership is going to be more educational than I expected. Indeed, I have numerous questions about human behavior. Zarathus saved her data and moved to the next specimen container. For instance, your literature mentions something called courtship rituals, but the descriptions vary dramatically. Some suggest elaborate displays, others mention simple verbal exchanges. How does one determine appropriate mating protocol? You're asking me for human dating advice. Dating? Is that a temporal reference? Do humans schedule reproductive activities according to calendar systems? Alina stared at her colleague, slowly realizing that Zarathus wasn't being deliberately provocative. She was genuinely trying to understand human behavior with the same scientific rigor she applied to gastropod reproduction. This is going to be a very interesting mission, Alina said finally. I certainly hope so, Zarathus replied, completely missing Alina's underlying meaning as she focused intently on a particularly active specimen. These centauran polyps are exhibiting unusual behavioral patterns. They appear to be flirting with each other. Alina leaned in to observe the display, acutely aware of Zarathus's proximity and the subtle, alien scent that seemed to surround her. Flirting. Watch their tentacle movements. See how they approach and retreat in rhythmic patterns. It's remarkably similar to the human courtship behaviors described in your databases. Great, Alina muttered. Even the polyps have better game than I do. Zarathus turned to her with bright, curious eyes. Game. Is courtship considered recreational competition among humans? Alina closed her eyes and counted to 10. This was definitely going to be a very long mission. 3 weeks into their approach toward the Tau Ceti system, Alina had grown accustomed to Zarathus's peculiar blend of scientific brilliance and social obliviousness. What she hadn't prepared for was the aliens' escalating fascination with human biology, particularly after their encounter with the indigenous fauna of Kepler 442b. The mating cycles of these Tau Ceti crystalfish are remarkable, Zarathus announced, manipulating the holographic display above their shared workstation. They reproduce precisely once every local year, synchronized with the planet's electromagnetic field fluctuations. Alina nodded absently, focused on calibrating the bioscanners for their upcoming planetary survey. Makes sense. Electromagnetic timing ensures the entire population reproduces simultaneously, maximizing genetic diversity. Exactly. One mating period, one offspring cycle, perfect efficiency. Zarathus paused, her pointed ears twitching in that way Alina had learned meant she was building up to an awkward question. This leads me to wonder about human reproductive efficiency. Here we go, Alina muttered, not looking up from her scanner array. Among the Velnari, we mate once per seasonal cycle when our neural harmonics align with planetary resonances. It is a deeply meaningful experience that occurs perhaps 4 times in our natural lifespan. Zarathus's voice took on a clinical tone that somehow made her next question even more mortifying. How frequently do humans engage in reproductive activities? Alina's hand slipped, sending a cascade of biosamples tumbling across the laboratory floor. That's a very personal question, Zarathus. Is it? I am simply curious about comparative reproductive biology. Your species is remarkably successful despite being relatively new to galactic civilization. I assumed this success must correlate with efficient reproductive strategies. Computer, initiate privacy screen around workstation 12. Alina called out, hoping to avoid another round of helpful commentary from the ship's increasingly nosy AI. Privacy screen engaged, the computer responded cheerfully. Though I should mention that Dr. Vasquez's biometric readings suggest significant cardiovascular stress. Perhaps a discussion of human mating habits would help her relax. I'm going to space that computer, Alina growled. Zarathus tilted her head, genuinely puzzled. Surely reproductive frequency is basic biological data. Among my people, such information is freely shared. For instance, my grandmother mated precisely 7 times in her century of life and produced 3 offspring. Quite respectable numbers. Humans are different, Alina said, gathering the scattered samples while trying to maintain her dignity. We don't exactly keep public scorecards, but surely there are averages, statistical norms. Zarathus's scientific persistence was both endearing and exasperating. The Velnari archives contain reproductive data for thousands of species. Human information is remarkably vague. Alina straightened, deciding that perhaps a clinical explanation might satisfy her colleague's curiosity and end this line of questioning. Fine. Humans can reproduce year-round, not just during specific seasons. We don't require electromagnetic alignment or neural harmonics. Basic biology. Fascinating. So perhaps monthly cycles, quarterly. Zarathus leaned forward with the intensity of a researcher on the verge of a breakthrough. More frequent than that. Weekly, Zarathus's ears perked up with interest. Alina felt her cheeks warming. Zarathus, humans can mate multiple times per day if they choose to. The silence that followed was deafening. Zarathus stared at Alina with the expression of someone who had just been told that water flows upward. Multiple times, per day. She repeated slowly. Yes. The same individuals, repeatedly, within a 24-hour period. It's physically possible, yes. Zarathus sat back in her chair, her pointed ears drooping slightly as she processed this information. That cannot be accurate. The energy expenditure alone would be prohibitive. The recovery time required. Humans have excellent recovery systems, Alina said, trying to sound professional while internally dying of embarrassment. But the neural strain, the cellular damage, how do you maintain cognitive function? Zarathus's voice pitched higher with each question. Among the Velnari, a single mating requires 3 days of meditation to restore mental equilibrium. We're built differently, I guess. Zarathus stood abruptly and began pacing the small confines of their privacy-screened area. This explains everything. Your species' rapid expansion across the galaxy, your adaptability, your seemingly inexhaustible energy reserves. You are biologically designed for endurance. I wouldn't put it quite like that. No wonder humans are such successful explorers. If you can maintain such physical resilience in reproductive matters, space travel must seem trivial by comparison. Zarathus spun to face Alina, her eyes bright with excitement. Your entire species is engineered for persistence. Alina couldn't help but laugh at her colleague's scientific enthusiasm. Zarathus, you're making us sound like some sort of endurance athletes. Are you not? Zarathus returned to her chair, leaning forward intently. Think about it logically. Humans arrive in any system and within decades establish thriving colonies. You adapt to hostile environments, extreme temperatures, atmospheric variations. Other species require centuries of preparation for such ventures. Well, when you put it that way. And now I discover that this adaptability extends to your most fundamental biological processes. It is remarkable. Zarathus paused, a curious expression crossing her features. Though I admit, I find myself wondering about the practical implications. Alina's brief moment of pride in her species' resilience evaporated. What kind of practical implications? Well, if humans can engage in reproductive behavior multiple times daily, how do you accomplish anything else? Do you schedule work around these activities? Is this why human ships have such extensive recreational facilities? Computer end privacy screen, Alina said quickly, hoping the return of potential observers would derail this line of inquiry. Privacy screen disengaged, the AI announced. I hope your discussion of human reproductive capabilities was informative, Dr. Vasquez. Based on my databases, humans average. Computer mute audio functions, Alina shouted. Audio muted appeared on the nearest text display, followed by what Alina could swear was a laughing emoji. Zarathus watched this exchange with fascination. Your ship's AI seems remarkably interested in reproductive statistics. Is this normal for human technology? Nothing about this conversation is normal, Alina muttered, returning to her bioscanner calibration with determined focus. I apologize if my questions have caused discomfort, Zarathus said, though she continued watching Alina with obvious scientific interest. I simply find human biology remarkably impressive. Among the Velnari, such endurance would be considered supernatural. Alina glanced up to find Zarathus studying her with something that looked suspiciously like admiration. The expression made Alina's stomach do strange things that had nothing to do with artificial gravity fluctuations. It's fine, Alina said softly. I'm just not used to discussing human capabilities like they're some kind of scientific phenomenon. But they are, Zarathus said earnestly. Your species possesses remarkable traits that most of the galaxy takes for granted, perhaps because humans themselves take them for granted. Their eyes met across the workstation, and Alina felt something shift in the space between them. Zarathus's scientific curiosity had evolved into something deeper, warmer, more personal. "Attention crew," came the captain's voice over the ship-wide communication system. "We are beginning final approach to Tau Ceti Prime. All research teams prepare for planetary survey deployment." Alina tore her gaze away from Zarathus and busied herself with equipment checks, acutely aware of her colleagues' continued attention. "Alina," Zarathus said quietly, "I hope you know that my interest in human biology extends beyond mere scientific curiosity." Alina's hand stilled on the scanner controls. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Zarathus said, her ears flushing slightly blue, "that I find myself increasingly fascinated by one human in particular." The emergency klaxons had been blaring for 23 minutes when Alina found herself crammed into Emergency Shelter Pod 7 with Zarathus, 3 irritable Centauran traders, and a philosophical Rigelian monk who kept humming meditation mantras off-key. The ion storm raging outside Omega Station had trapped them all until the electromagnetic interference subsided. "This is cozy," Alina muttered, trying to find a comfortable position in the cramped space while avoiding the Centaurans' excessive tentacles. "The proximity is indeed intimate," Zarathus agreed, somehow managing to look composed despite being pressed against Alina's side. "Though I must say, this situation provides an excellent opportunity for comparative behavioral analysis." "Please tell me you're not planning to study our fellow refugees," Alina whispered. "Of course not. That would be unethical. Zarathus paused, though I cannot help but notice that the Centaurans are exhibiting synchronized breathing patterns typical of pre-mating rituals. Alina glanced at the three traders, who were indeed breathing in perfect unison while their tentacles intertwined in complex patterns. Maybe they're just stressed. Unlikely. Notice how their chromatophores are shifting to deeper purples. Classic courtship coloration. Zarathus leaned closer to Alina, ostensibly to avoid a particularly enthusiastic tentacle wave. I believe we may witness a rare three-way Centauran bonding ceremony. In an emergency shelter. During an ion storm. Alina tried to ignore how nice Zarathus smelled, even in their current predicament. Emergency situations often trigger reproductive behaviors, Zarathus explained matter-of-factly. Many species respond to stress by attempting to ensure genetic continuation. It is quite logical, actually. The Rigelian monk's humming reached a particularly discordant note, causing everyone in the pod to wince. "Sorry," he called out cheerfully. "The electromagnetic interference is disrupting my harmonic resonance. Usually, I'm much more melodious." "Could be worse," Alina said. "At least you're not sprouting extra limbs like some species do during ion storms." "Oh, that would be the Delphian shapeshifters," Zarathus said with interest. "They temporarily develop additional appendages during electromagnetic events. Purely defensive, though some researchers theorize it originally evolved as a mating display." "Everything comes back to reproduction with you, doesn't it?" Alina asked, though she was smiling. "It is one of the most fundamental biological drives," Zarathus replied seriously. "Though I admit, my recent exposure to human reproductive capabilities has broadened my perspective considerably." One of the Centaurans made a sound that might have been laughter. "Human reproductive capabilities." His translator rendered his voice in a distinctly amused tone. "Oh, this should be entertaining." Alina felt her cheeks burning. "It's not what you think." No, please continue," another Centauran encouraged, his tentacles practically vibrating with mirth. "We've heard rumors about human stamina, but never from such an authoritative source." "I merely mentioned that humans can mate multiple times per day," Zarathus said innocently. "It was quite shocking." "Multiple times per day," the third Centauran exclaimed, his chromatophores flashing bright yellow with surprise. "By the Great Spiral, no wonder humans are taking over the galaxy." "We're not taking over anything," Alina protested weakly. "Oh, you absolutely are," the Rigelian monk chimed in, temporarily abandoning his meditation. "Humans show up, establish colonies, reproduce prolifically, and before you know it, there's a Starbucks on every space station." "What's a Starbucks?" Zarathus asked. "Human caffeine distribution centers," Alina explained. "They're actually quite popular. See, cultural domination through strategic beverage placement," the first Centauran said sagely. "Combined with their apparent reproductive advantages, it's a brilliant conquest strategy." "It's not a conquest strategy," Alina insisted. "We just like coffee. And apparently each other," the second Centauran added with what Alina was learning to recognize as the Centauran equivalent of a smirk. Zarathus's ears perked up with interest. Actually, the correlation between human caffeine consumption and reproductive activity might be worth investigating. Do you suppose there's a biological connection? "I'm not having this conversation," Alina said, covering her face with her hands. "Oh, but it's fascinating from a xenobiological perspective," the Rigelian monk said, apparently finding this discussion more interesting than his mantras. "In my travels, I've observed that humans do seem remarkably energetic in their personal relationships." "Energetic is one way to put it," the third Centauran agreed. "My cousin works on a human colony ship. Says they had to soundproof the residential quarters because of all the enthusiasm." Alina wanted to disappear into the pod's emergency cushioning. "Can we please talk about literally anything else?" "But this explains so much about human behavior," Zarathus continued, completely oblivious to Alina's mortification. Your species' legendary persistence, your ability to adapt to any environment, your remarkable endurance during long-term space missions. Wait, the first Centauran interrupted, his tentacles stilling. Are you suggesting that human reproductive capacity translates to other areas of performance? It would make evolutionary sense, Zarathus mused. A species that can maintain such physical resilience in one area would likely exhibit similar traits across multiple biological systems. The Rigelian monk nodded thoughtfully. That would explain why humans are such effective diplomats. They simply outlast everyone else in negotiations. And why they're excellent at long-term scientific research, added the second Centauran. They have the stamina for extended observation periods. Don't forget their legendary stubbornness, the third Centauran contributed. Now I understand, it's not stubbornness, it's endurance. Alina looked around the pod at 6 pairs of eyes studying her with scientific fascination, as if she were some sort of exotic specimen. You're all completely missing the point. What point? Zarathus asked earnestly. The point is. Alina paused, suddenly realizing she wasn't entirely sure what point she was trying to make. The point is that human reproductive behavior isn't some kind of superpower. Isn't it though? The Rigelian monk asked gently. From our perspective, the ability to maintain such vitality while also excelling at space exploration, scientific research, and diplomatic relations does seem rather extraordinary. Zarathus leaned closer to Alina, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow still managed to carry in the small space. I have been thinking about what you told me regarding human capabilities. Oh no, Alina muttered. Not in a purely clinical sense, Zarathus continued, her ears flushing that delicate blue color Alina was beginning to find dangerously attractive. I find myself curious about the practical applications of such endurance. The practical applications? Well, yes. If humans can exhibit such stamina in reproductive matters, I imagine you must be equally persistent in other, intimate endeavors. The Centaurans exchanged meaningful looks with their tentacles, while the Rigelian monk's humming took on a distinctly interested tone. Zarathus, Alina said carefully, are you asking what I think you're asking? I am simply noting that human endurance might manifest in various forms of physical intimacy, not necessarily limited to reproductive acts. Zarathus's scientific tone did nothing to disguise the warmth in her eyes. It would be fascinating to investigate such theories. Alina stared at her colleague, slowly realizing that Zarathus's scientific curiosity had evolved into something much more personal and considerably more dangerous to Alina's peace of mind. Well, she said finally, I suppose that would depend on finding the right research partner. Zarathus smiled, an expression both innocent and decidedly not innocent. I believe I may have found one. The emergency klaxons finally fell silent, but Alina barely noticed. The evacuation alarms aboard the Meridian's Edge had been screaming for 6 hours when Alina finally collapsed into the command chair of Emergency Transport 7, her hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Beside her, Zarathus worked with mechanical precision, coordinating refugee placement across their makeshift fleet, while monitoring 17 different communication channels simultaneously. That's the last transport from Kepler Station, Alina reported, watching the final evacuation ship disappear into hyperspace. 2,000 civilians safe, thanks to your navigation calculations. Thanks to your refusal to abandon the outer settlements, Zarathus corrected, her pointed ears drooping with fatigue. Most species would have retreated after the first wave of hegemony attacks. Alina laughed weakly. Yeah, well, apparently humans are too stubborn to know when to quit. Not stubborn, persistent. Zarathus turned to face her, those large eyes bright despite their exhaustion. Over these past 72 hours, I have observed something remarkable. What's that? Alina asked, though she was barely conscious enough to focus on the answer. You have been awake for 3 standard days, coordinating rescue operations across 6-star systems, negotiating with hostile alien species, and maintaining perfect emotional composure while thousands of lives depended on your decisions. Zarathis leaned forward, her scientific fascination unmistakable even in their desperate circumstances. This is the endurance I wondered about. This isn't the same thing as, Alina began, then stopped as she realized what Zarathis was really saying. Isn't it? The capacity for sustained effort, the ability to push beyond apparent limits, the resilience to recover and continue when others would collapse. Zarathis smiled, though exhaustion made it soft around the edges. I asked you about human mating frequency because I was curious about your species' reputation for persistence. Now, I understand that your biological capabilities reflect something much deeper. Alina stared at her colleague, her tired brain slowly processing this revelation. You've been studying human endurance this whole time, not just reproductive endurance. All endurance is connected, Alina. Physical, emotional, intellectual, spiritual. Your species doesn't just mate frequently. You commit fully to whatever you undertake. Zarathis gestured toward the star-filled view screen where the last of their refugee convoy was disappearing into safe hyperspace corridors. You spend 3 days saving strangers because giving up isn't in your nature. Computer, status report on convoy safety, Alina called out, still not quite ready to accept Zarathis's analysis. All refugee ships have reached secure sectors, the AI responded cheerfully. Mission success rate, 100%. Casualties, 0. Dr. Vasquez, your performance metrics exceed normal human operational parameters by approximately 300%. See, Zarathis said with satisfaction, exceptional endurance across all categories. Alina rubbed her temples, trying to process everything that had happened since the emergency began. Zarathis, when this started, you were curious about human reproductive habits. Now you're making it sound like some kind of philosophical revelation about human nature. Because it is. Zarathis stood and moved to the pilot station, checking their course back to Velnari space. Among my people, mating occurs rarely because it requires enormous energy expenditure. We must rest for days afterward, meditate to restore our mental balance. When I learned that humans can mate multiple times per day, I initially thought it was simply efficient biology. And now I understand that it represents your fundamental approach to existence. Humans don't just reproduce frequently. You love frequently, work frequently, explore frequently, fight for others frequently. You throw yourselves completely into whatever you choose to do. Alina felt something shift in her understanding, not just of Zarathis's curiosity, but of her own species' place in the galaxy. So all those embarrassing questions were my attempt to understand how humans became so successful so quickly. Other species take centuries to establish colonies, millennia to develop interstellar relationships. Humans accomplish in decades what takes us geological ages. Because we don't hold back, Alina said slowly. Because you cannot hold back, it is not in your nature. Zarathis returned to her seat, this time sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. This is why I find myself so fascinated by you personally, Alina. You embody everything remarkable about your species. Alina turned to face her, suddenly aware that they were alone on the transport, racing through hyperspace with nothing but time and honesty between them. Zarathis, are you saying that your interest in me started as scientific research? It started as scientific curiosity, yes. Zarathis's ears flushed. That delicate blue color that Alina had learned meant her colleague was being particularly honest. But it became something else entirely when I realized that your capacity for endurance extends to emotional connections. What do you mean? You have spent months patiently answering my inappropriate questions, tolerating my cultural misunderstandings, and treating my scientific obsessions with kindness instead of irritation. Zarathis reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing Alina's hand. That is not biological endurance. That is emotional generosity. Alina stared down at their joined hands, finally understanding what had been building between them throughout their mission. Zarathis, when you asked me about human mating frequency, I thought you were just being awkward. I was being awkward, but I was also falling in love with a species that commits completely to everything they do. Zarathis's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and with one member of that species in particular. Alina felt her heart rate spike in a way that had nothing to do with emergency situations or evacuation stress. So what happens now? Now I would like to test a hypothesis, Zarathis said, moving closer with scientific precision and decidedly unscientific intent. What hypothesis? That human emotional endurance is as remarkable as your physical capabilities. Zarathis's lips were inches from Alina's now, and that it might be compatible with Velnari devotion, which, while less frequent, tends to be quite thorough. Alina laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine joy despite their exhaustion. Are you proposing a long-term research project? The longest term possible, Zarathis confirmed. I believe it may take several decades to properly document human emotional resilience, possibly a lifetime. That's a very extensive study, Alina said, her voice slightly breathless as Zarathis's alien scent filled her senses. Humans are a complex species. They require thorough investigation. Alina closed the distance between them, finally answering the question that had started their entire relationship. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Alina smiled at her colleague turned something much more. Computer, file a request for permanent research partnership assignment, Alina said without taking her eyes off Zarathis. Partnership request logged. The AI responded with what Alina could swear was approval. Shall I also update your personal files to reflect your new relationship status? Computer, Zarathis said firmly, update both our files to indicate ongoing collaborative research into interspecies compatibility. Estimated completion date, indefinite. Research project logged. Congratulations on beginning what promises to be